in the cold reaches of the Persine expanse, deep within the starlit halls of Arkanspire, the Apex Council convened, a coalition of the galaxy's most dangerous lifeforms. They weren't diplomats in the traditional sense. They were survivors. Evolution's most brutal answers to unforgiving worlds. Each member species had earned their seat not through civility, but through conquest, endurance, and dominance over Deathworld's planets so hostile, they devoured the weak and scarred. The strong to live on a Deathworld was a badge of honor. To thrive on one made you elite, the Rask from Jorak Prime. Born into gravity twice Earth's, could snap steel with a single limb. The Myron of Salathar, whose blood ran molten, had skin that repelled plasma. The Vornok, blind cave hunters from Thrisics needed neither light nor sleep, only scent and silence. And they believed with absolute certainty they were the pinnacle of evolution. Their code was simple. Only Deathworlders understand survival. Or burn. No peaceful species had ever stood against them. No alliance of herbivores or amphibious thinkers had ever lasted. And so, the Apex Council grew comfortable in its certainty. It's proud, arrogant. Until one day, Scow Beacon returned from a forgotten arm of the galaxy, a little spiral tucked away between interstellar debris fields. The system it came from was unremarkable. A single yellow star, few gas giants. One blue planet, medium-sized, oxygen-rich, Earth. At first, the beacon was dismissed. Hundreds of such signals came in weekly. Most led to dead rocks or fungal intelligence. But then came the second signal, stronger, encrypted in 3 languages. It requested formal contact. It called itself a message of peace from the people of Earth. It included cultural samples, mathematics, and something the Council found insulting. Humor is this. Satire, hissed the Myron delegate as the audio samples played. They're laughing? They're mocking us? Spat the Vornok chieftain. Or worse, they don't know fear. The Apex Council, for the first time in centuries, did not know how to interpret the newcomer. This Earth had survived without any known galactic trade. It's no confirmed military, no history of contact, and yet it had technology, art, philosophy, and worst of all, curiosity. The Rosk war clan wanted immediate reconnaissance. Vornak favored covert infiltration. The Myron suggested a psychological profile first. Something wasn't right. But before a vote could be held, a diplomatic envoy from Earth arrived on the edge of the Sidran sector, a ship not made of living metal or gravitic alloy, but crude titanium and carbon composites. Inefficient, unrefined, primitive, and yet it landed smoothly. It transmitted flawlessly. And it greeted the Apex Council in all of their languages, including one no longer spoken outside ancient death chants of the Rosk. The humans had done their homework. They called themselves explorers, scientists, survivors. And, with smiles that showed teeth, so many teeth, they said, "We heard someone out here likes a challenge." For the first time in living memory, the Apex Council didn't laugh. Something was different about these newcomers. Something familiar, like the scent of a rival beast, just beyond the tree line. And so the Council watched, curious, silent, predatory after all. They called themselves Deathworlders, but they'd never met humans. Asterisk, the Council didn't send warships, not yet. It would have shown fear. Instead, they dispatched a diplomatic observer vessel, lightly armed, but equipped with high-grade sensor arrays and full biological containment systems. A token gesture, really. A way to assess this Earth species before deciding whether it should be absorbed, ignored, or extinguished. The ship was crewed by 3 representatives, a Rosk enforcer, muscle, and menace incarnate, a Myron analyst, cold and clinical in thought, and a Vornok tracker, near invisible in shadow and master of silence. Together, they formed a typical Apex Survey Triadan elite team trained to judge the worth of emerging civilizations. Job wasn't to make friends. It was to evaluate, categorize, and report back. Like scientists studying bacteria, as the ship descended into Earth's orbit, crew prepared for the usual signs of panic. Planetary defense signals, atmospheric scrambling, hails of desperate transmissions. Instead, they were met with protocol. Organized, calm, and unmistakably human. Unidentified vessel. This is Earth Space Traffic Control. You are entering a monitored orbit. Please adjust vector and stand by for a diplomatic channel. The Rask grunted. They sound unimpressed. Or unaware, muttered the Myron, fingers twitching as data scrolled across his forearm screen. But their signal is clean. To clean. The Vornok said nothing, its presence little more than a shifting shimmer in the corner of the chamber. The ship followed the transmission's coordinates and docked with one of Earth's orbital platforms. It wasn't military, but it was far from fragile. It's built with steel and recycled alloys. It looked patched together, and yet, somehow, it had redundancy protocols more advanced than some Apex warships. The humans who greeted them were clad in dark uniforms, unarmed but alert. One smiled. Welcome to Earth. You'll find our coffee strong and our curiosity stronger. The Rosk bared its teeth in what it hoped was a threat. The human didn't flinch. Instead, he handed over a data slate loaded with environmental readings, medical compatibility scans, and a translated version of Earth's interstellar civility protocol, something they'd apparently drafted just in case aliens ever showed up. Prepared. Not militarized, but prepared. That was rare. The Myron began subtle scanning during the meeting. Human biology was primitive, yes. Weak bones, narrow respiratory ranges, highly vulnerable to radiation, and yet adaptable. Their immune systems were chaotic, not designed like machines, but more like forests, evolving constantly, fighting everything in their eyes. So expressive, so alert. Watching everything, the Vornok tried to shadow walk during the tour of the station, a trick it had used countless times to observe without being observed. But when it phased into the darkened corridor, a human maintenance worker looked up from behind a panel and said, "You lost." The Vornok blinked, materializing. "How did you?" "Infrared sensor in the air vents," the man said casually. "Chewing gum. Also, you kind of hum a little when you vanish. It's like a weird tuning fork. No fear, no aggression. It's just curiosity." Later that day, the crew observed a simulation test. Humans called it a disaster drill. On a signal, the station lights cut, artificial gravity fluctuated, and simulated fire broke out in multiple sectors. There was no screaming, no chaos. Humans moved with precision. Teams rotated into danger zones. Fires were extinguished. Wounded were carried not just by medics, but by engineers, technicians, janitors. Everyone adapted. Everyone moved. The Rask, stunned, muttered. They train their civilians for crisis. They expect crisis, the Myron whispered. That's not protocol, that's instinct. The data they gathered over 2 days was baffling. Humans were inconsistent. They laughed in the face of warnings. They joked about mortality. They played games where they simulated war, loss, survival, and called them entertainment. They weren't the strongest species the Council had encountered, but they were unpredictable. And unpredictability, in Apex terminology, was more dangerous than raw strength. On the final day, human child approached the triad in the docking bay. The Vornok instinctively hissed. The child didn't run. "Are you monsters?" she asked, tilting her head. The Myron started to answer, but the Rosk leaned down, intrigued. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look like the ones in my dreams." "Ones that try to eat people." The Rask grinned. "And what do the people do?" "They kick their butts," she said proudly, and ran off laughing. Back aboard their ship, the Apex Triad held silence for several minutes. The Myron finally broke it. "If they're this capable during peace, they're not prey." The Rosk growled. "Not even close." "They might be predators," the Myron added. The Vornok, still silent, activated the stealth relay and sent the encrypted report to the Apex Council. One line stood out above the rest. "Earth is not to be approached lightly. This species carries something we do not yet understand." They're not merely adapted to a death world. They thrive in one of their own making. The ship departed orbit. Earth shrank beneath them. But in the minds of the apex, the image only grew. Larger, unsettling, unfinished, unknown. The kind of unknown you either destroy immediately or fear forever. Asterisk, the Apex Council received the Triad's report with grim interest. Normally, such evaluations were routine. Analyze, rate the threat level, extract resources, and if necessary, neutralize potential disruption. But Earth didn't fit the mold. The data contradicted expectations. The psychological profile was fragmented. Behaviorally, the humans were erratic equal parts, strategic and reckless, compassionate and brutal. The Council did not like unknowns. Unknowns could not be categorized. Unknowns made apex predators nervous to understand humanity's true nature. The Council authorized what it called a controlled compatibility test. Officially, it was a joint relief exercise. In practice, it was a trap. A crisis had been quietly manufactured on the moon of Carat 7. Tectonically unstable orb bathed in sulfur storms and native apex predators eel-spined, skulkers with venom sacs, and a taste for carbon-based life. The Council labeled it an aid mission, inviting Earth to dispatch a response team in the name of interstellar cooperation. The humans agreed without hesitation. They sent 20 volunteers. No warships. No drones. Just boots on the jagged ground, backpacks filled with basic supplies, and helmets adorned with simple blue flags, a symbol for peace, they said. The Ross commander, observing from orbit, scoffed. 20? Are they arrogant or suicidal? Myron analyst beside him murmured, maybe both. The moment the humans set down, the planet's wrath made itself known. Lightning cracked the sulfur clouds like whips. Winds peeled metal plating off pre-built shelters. The terrain rolled beneath their feet with seismic tremors. The first scout drone they deployed was swallowed whole by the ground in under 3 minutes. The Apex observers watched and waited for the panic. It never came. Instead, the humans got to work. They built a base not by waiting for prefabricated modules, but by using local mineral sheets as thermal shielding and bonding them with improvised chemical foam synthesized on-site. One of them pulled apart a broken atmospheric stabilizer, rewired it into a crude wind barrier, and said something about field MacGyvering, which no translator could explain. When a native predator attacked the camp on the second night, the humans didn't fire blindly. They used decoy flares to lure it into a ravine, and they collapsed the ravine with seismic charges. Charges they extracted from their landing struts. Explosives made from landing gear. By day 5, they had mapped 3 kilometers of the surrounding terrain, cataloged the local ecosystem, and erected a functioning weather tower. By day 7, they were hosting a barbecue. Actual meat. Cooked. Over plasma-filtered heat coils, jokes were made. Songs were sung. One of the humans told a horror story that made 2 Vornak observers leave early. The Myron attempted to infiltrate the base through a chameleon cloak protocol. It failed. The human motion sensors didn't detect the cloaking field they detected. The temperature displacement caused by it. The Rask tried to challenge a human team member to a physical duel as a cultural exchange. The human declined. Instead, they proposed a chess match. The Rask lost in 6 turns. The observers began transmitting footage to the Council, not of a super soldier race, but of something worse, a culture of functional chaos. Humans didn't dominate their environment by overpowering it. They collaborated with it. They didn't conquer their obstacles. They adapted, absorbed, and redefined them. They had no template, no script. That made them impossible to predict. The final report labeled the experiment a failure, not because the humans performed poorly, but because they rendered the metrics irrelevant. The tests weren't designed for a species that broke the rules as a matter of instinct. In a debrief aboard their extraction vessel, one of the humans said something that would echo through Apex Council chambers for weeks. We're not the strongest. We're not the smartest. But drop us anywhere. Take away our tools. Cut off our support. We'll still find a way to build a fire, make a plan, and turn the situation into a story worth telling. That's what we do. We endure, then we thrive. The Rask commander, who had seen 7 planetary wars and once ripped a man's spine out during negotiations, could only mutter, "They didn't even bring weapons." And yet the moon now bore their mark. It's not in blood or fire, but in footprints. Innovation. In a solar-powered espresso machine they left behind as a gift. The Council had sought proof of weakness instead. They found the most dangerous form of strength, not dominance, resilience. And that terrified them more than any army ever could. Asterisk. The Apex Council no longer debated humanity's existence. That phase was over. Now they argued over its implications. Some saw opportunity, a chance to harness a species capable of thriving in environments the Council's best engineers still treated as high risk. Others saw only danger. Uncontrolled growth, cultural contamination, evolution unchecked by the chains of galactic protocol. And then there were those who simply hated not being on top anymore, so as fear quietly seeped into their collective pride, the Council did what apex predators always do when confronted by something unfamiliar. They tested it. This time, it wouldn't be a staged crisis on a backwater moon. It would be no illusion of collaboration. There's no polite exchange of tools and translators. The Council needed dominance reasserted. And for that, they needed spectacle. The Myron suggested trial, a neutral zone combat simulation framed as interspecies training. 1 squad from the Apex Council, 1 from Earth. No lethal rounds, just skill, strategy, and supremacy. The humans agreed again, without hesitation. No hesitation. Never hesitation that in itself unnerved the Council. The trial was held on Eleanor 3, a dry, wind-scoured world long used for military wargames. The terrain was unforgiving, cracked basalt plains, volcanic vents, and fractured cliffs known for spontaneous rock slides. No atmosphere worth breathing, no resources worth mining, just hardship, perfect. The Council's team consisted of 12 veterans, 4 Myron tacticians, 3 Rosk heavy infantry, 3 Vornok recon, and 2 combat engineers from a lesser-known Deathworld, species bred for subterranean conflict. They were armed, trained, and genetically modified for this. The humans sent 8. Just 8. The Council's observers scoffed. More of their arrogance, surely. Or maybe they had simply grown used to being underestimated. Then the match began. It was expected the Apex team would seize control within the first 2 hours, driving the humans into retreat or surrender. That didn't happen. By hour 1, the Rosk had triggered a minefield 1 that didn't exist on the official terrain maps. The humans had built it during their first 30 minutes on the surface, using thermal beacons repurposed from their landing module and proximity sensors taped together. With heat-shielding foil, the Vornak attempted to flank through the ravine. 2 of them went missing, not killed, not wounded, missing. Hours later, they were found, bound gently with rope and left beside a care package containing protein bars and a note that read, "Nice try. Let's do coffee next time." The Myron attempted a coordinated strike during a simulated sandstorm. Visibility was near 0. Perfect conditions for Apex units with thermal sight. But the humans had vanished. When the storm cleared, 3 Apex units had been lured into a natural venting system, their gear fried from sudden heat exposure. One of the engineers described the human tactics as guerrilla warfare laced with psychological sabotage. Another called it annoyingly creative. By the end of the first day, the Apex Council was no longer watching with superiority. They were watching with quiet dread. Every Apex advantage was neutralized, not with superior tech, but creative abuse of local conditions. The humans turned every disadvantage into a tool. Weakness became strength. Limitations became weapons. And the worst part, they laughed while doing it. "Who are these people?" asked the Vornok tactician, dazed and dehydrated after walking in. "Circles through a heat mirage created by reflective foil and thermal distortion panels." "Humans," replied the Myron commander through clenched mandibles. "They fight like the terrain is a teammate. On the final day of the simulation, the Apex forces were ordered to initiate a mock orbital strike. A satellite beacon was deployed. Standard procedure, symbolic of last resort dominance. The beacon never activated. It had been rewired, repurposed. Left broadcasting a simple message back to the Apex flagship: "We win." "You're welcome." The council went silent. Not because their warriors had been defeated, but because they had been outperformed in every domain they considered sacred. Strength, stealth, and strategy. They had entered the trial expecting resistance. What they encountered was superiority wrapped in humility. The humans didn't brag. They didn't posture. And asked for commentary, their squad leader simply said, "We like games, especially the ones where we're not expected to win." There were no medals given, no trophies exchanged, just silence. And data, and a dozen. Council species who now stared at humanity through a lens they had never used before, not as primed, not as curiosities, but as a mirror reflection of what it meant to survive without. The comfort of knowing you're the strongest thing in the room, because humanity had never known that comfort, and so they never relied on it, and that made them dangerous. Not in theory, not in potential, but in proof. The simulation was over, and the real war was beginning, not of guns or bombs, but of fear, diplomacy. The influence the Apex Council had. Never admitted defeat, not publicly. But after the Eleanor 3 simulation, no declarations were needed. The data spoke louder than humiliation. Combat superiority, shattered. Technological dominance, bypassed with ingenuity. Psychological edge, eroded by laughter, improvisation, and unnerving confidence. And so the council, still desperate to understand, turned to the one domain it still believed it ruled. Biology to the apex. Superiority was coded in the flesh. Muscles born under crushing gravity. Organs resistant to acid. Nervous systems evolved to function under extremes. They had studied themselves endlessly, refining combat breeds and defense morphs for millennia. They would decode humanity. It two molecules and instincts. And in doing so, they would find the flaw. The weak link. Every creature had one. They just hadn't found humanity's yet, so they dug deeper. Covert agents, some Vornak, some synthetic mimics, were deployed under diplomatic pretense. Human biology samples were retrieved, blood, tissue, neural maps, even archived DNA from ancient Earth databases. The first reports were ... inconclusive. Human biology was, on the surface, unimpressive. Bone density was suboptimal, reaction time average. Thermal tolerance wildly inconsistent. By Apex standards, humans were fragile, slower than Rosk, weaker than Myron, less stealthy than Vornak, susceptible to radiation, prone to infection, and burdened by inefficient organs like the appendix and sinus cavities. And yet, they endured. In every hostile environment the Council had monitored, humans not only survived, they stabilized. They adapted, repaired, rerouted. They grew stronger in chaos. And the longer the scientists studied, the more disturbed they became. The human immune system, for instance, was not orderly like that of the Myron. It was chaotic, filled with redundancies, aggressive mutations, and barely regulated countermeasures. It attacked not just pathogens, but itself. It learned not through instruction, but through brutal trial and error. Human cells aged and broke, and yet they adapted around the degradation. Telomeres frayed, but in doing so, it triggered biochemical flags that pushed for replication, repair, even rebirth. Emotion was no cleaner, where most species evolved to avoid trauma. Humans embraced it not because they enjoyed it, but because it built something in them. Their psychology had names for this. Resilience, grit, post-traumatic growth. The Myron found it offensive. Their minds should collapse, one researcher hissed. They do collapse. Another snapped. Then they rebuild stronger. Who does that? Worse. Still was the neurochemical architecture. Humans experienced joy from social bonding, yes, but also from risk, from danger, from chaos. They chased adrenaline, manufactured fear, simulated death for entertainment. Their ancient history was riddled with blood sport, horror tales, and stories of monsters not to run from, but to become. Their culture romanticized survival not as a burden but as a narrative, one where the odds were always stacked against them. And they triumphed anyway. That ... was unprecedented. And then came the genetic comparative study, a project that nearly resulted in the withdrawal of 3 council species. The Apex's top xenogeneticists mapped human DNA against environmental survivability indexes across 20 Deathworld classifications. Humans scored within expected ranges for baseline endurance. Then the researchers tested stress-induced mutations, variability under duress, epigenetic drift in extreme conditions, neural restructuring following trauma, and the results. Terrifying, no species in recorded council history had such potential for adaptive divergence. Under stress, humans didn't simply crack or fail. They changed physiologically, behaviorally, generationally. The report's summary included a line that would later be classified as restricted under Council security protocols. Humans are not evolved to survive a single threat. They are evolved to encounter the unknown and turn it into familiarity. They are not stable because they are not meant to be. Their genetic chaos is their greatest weapon. The Vornok lead analyst deleted her findings, not out of fear, but out of shame. We are optimized, she whispered. They are unbounded. The Myron were the first to panic. Discussions of containment began. Quarantine measures, genetic suppression viruses, tactical extinction protocols. But the Rosk disagreed. Extinction? One of their war priests growled. You don't hunt the fire when it warms the forest. You don't kill the storm just because it refuses to kneel. Other voices emerged, quieter and more dangerous. Perhaps, said a coalition diplomat, we should not study the humans. Perhaps we should ally with them. The council chamber descended into chaos. Lines were drawn, old loyalties questioned. A species that couldn't be categorized was one thing, but a species that could infect ideology, that was worse than war. A few days later, a lone sentence began circulating anonymously through black market intelligence channels. The humans are not Deathworlders. They are the death of Deathworlds. It was written in a dozen languages. No one claimed authorship, but it didn't need to be signed. Everyone knew the truth was out, and for the first time in its long, brutal history, the Apex Council felt small. Asterisk, the Apex Council had stood for over 9 centuries. Formed through blood and survival, it was never a peaceful institution, but it was stable. Stability among apex predators is not forged in harmony, it is carved. In fear, balanced by mutual deterrence, and wrapped in tradition so old it becomes indistinguishable from truth. But truth had changed, and Earth was to blame. The revelations about human biology had spread like wildfire. Despite the Council's best efforts, the knowledge leaked beyond the inner chambers. Words like adaptive chaos, genetic plasticity, and cultural resilience appeared in academic networks, military channels, and most damningly in the public. Infiloops of outer rim species. For the Council, the panic wasn't just about humans being dangerous. It was about humans being contagious. They didn't just adapt to new threats. They invited them. They didn't just survive change. They thrived on it. And that ideology, spontaneous, unpredictable, and wildly optimistic, was starting to spread outer. System species, long subjugated under Council protectorates, began whispering a new word through encrypted channels and forbidden tavern halls. Humanity, not Earth, not Terrans, not a species designation. A concept, a story, a myth being born in real time. And that was the Council's worst fear realized. Not warships, not viruses, but the rise of a narrative they couldn't control. A species that couldn't be dominated in body was a threat. A species that couldn't be dominated in story was a revolution. The fractures began quietly on Delrec Station. Vornak governor refused an order to block human trade delegations. She cited structural independence, but everyone knew better. Within weeks, her station was displaying Earth-grown food, human-written novels, and something called rock music that caused confusion. Mild nausea and inexplicable loyalty in many listeners. Elsewhere, the Creelan amphibious species that had always kept its head low under council rule petition to allow human exchange students into their planetary survival academies. When questioned, the Creel Chancellor replied, "We do not wish to survive like prey anymore. Wish to learn from predators who smile when they're wounded." Council Central issued warnings, actions, quiet disappearances. But the unraveling had begun. In closed sessions, paranoia bloomed. The Myron faction demanded preemptive action. Contain Earth, quarantine it, cut off contact, shut down all cultural exchange. The Rosk, however, growled for something else. Not war. Not yet. But study. They are not infection, said one of their war priests. They are the next stage. The Vornak, once silent observers, split in half. Some advocated caution. Others, the younger ones, began to openly emulate humans wearing mimicry attire, adopting Terran slang and even telling jokes in diplomatic sessions, something previously considered a sign of neurological disease. The council chamber once, a bastion of cold command, now echoed with uncertainty. Lines were no longer drawn between species. They were drawn between those who feared change and those who wanted to become it, human diplomats. Unaware of the chaos they were causing, continued spreading their influence the only way they knew how, through connection, through shared food, music, games, and those odd Terran values that made no tactical sense but still managed to charm entire planetary blocks. Kindness, some called it. Others called it weakness, disguised as strength. But for many at the edge of apex control, it felt like a new kind of gravity, one that didn't crush them under weight. It pulled them toward something warmer than survival. And the more they looked at humanity, the more they saw themselves not as they were, but as they could be. Then came the breaking point. A mid-tier Deathworld colony, long ruled by Apex law, announced its independence. Not with weapons, but with art. An orbital broadcast played a human-made video compilation, scenes of Earth's wars and peace, its worst atrocities and brightest recoveries, images of oceans, laughter, extinction, rebirth. The final message was voiced by a human child. We were never the strongest, but we never stopped getting back up. You don't need permission to stand. You just need to stop kneeling. It went viral across 5 sectors, and the Apex Council, the first time in its brutal history, had no idea what to do. Diplomacy had failed. Intimidation had backfired. Propaganda had been hijacked. You couldn't crush a species that didn't. Want to crush back? Couldn't outmaneuver a species that saw every loss as a lesson. Couldn't outlast a species whose core instinct wasn't dominance, but persistence. The fractures widened. And from those fractures, the first whispers of rebellion began, not with torches or banners, but with questions. What if strength wasn't about being feared? What if survival wasn't the endgame? What if humanity was right? The Apex Council still existed, but it no longer ruled. It began quietly, not with the clang of warships or declarations of conquest, but with silence. A colony station at the edge of the rim-dark expanse went dark. No distress signals, no wreckage, just silence. Then another disappeared, and another 3. In one cycle, by the time the 4th station's emergency beacon screamed into the void, it was already too late. The Apex Council scrambled what remained of its fractured fleet's once proud armadas, now hollowed by distrust. Splintered loyalties and species more focused on Earth's influence than their own unity. What arrived at the source of the signal wasn't a fleet of invaders. It was a wall. A vast, angular lattice of metal and synthetic flesh stretching across a third of a planetary orbit, moving slowly, stoppably, like a wound in space itself. No markings, no broadcasts, no demands, only inaction. Assimilation drones, the size of buildings, poured into the atmosphere. They didn't negotiate. They didn't study. They consumed. They tore apart alloy, harvested biomass. disassembled everything into base components, and fed it back into their own holes, growing as they destroyed. This was no enemy the Council had prepared for, no ideology to debate, no culture to understand. Just hunger, mechanical and ancient, a forgotten threat. Something buried in pre-Council history, never believed to be real. They were given a name by the first Rosk fleet that engaged them, the Nulltide. The Rosk fleet lasted 11 minutes. The Myron lost an entire data world in 30. The Council, for the first time in its existence, called for full galactic retreat, and no one listened. They had ruled with fear, but fear was now everywhere. The Council was no longer the voice in the dark. It was just another whisper, drowned out by the sound of a coming storm. It was a Vornak emissary who said the unspeakable first. We have to ask the humans, not order them, not coerce. Ask pride shattered in that sentence. But reality doesn't bow to ego, and so, for the first time in galactic history, an emergency delegation arrived on Earth. Not to judge, not to test, not to infiltrate, but to plead. They expected conditions, demands political theater. Instead, they were offered coffee. No fanfare. No threats. Just a plain conference room in a United Nations orbital station and a middle-aged human with tired eyes and a quiet voice. You need help? He said, okay. Where do we start? No gloating, no superiority, only motion. Humans moved like the war had already begun. They pulled outdated blueprints, repurposed old spacecraft, began integrating their chaotic tech with Council systems so incompatible they once needed. Translators to communicate between wires. What others saw as incompatible, humans saw as a challenge. They drafted strategies the apex war colleges called suicidal and made them work. They weaponized unpredictability, launching decoy fleets made of scrap holes and remote drones, flooding enemy sensors with corrupted music files that mimicked distress signals. One battle was won when human pilots ejected entire containers of ball bearings into a drone corridor, jamming their movement algorithms. Every time the Nulltide adapted, humans changed faster, and they inspired others to do the same. Rosk warlords began laughing before combat like humans. Myron engineers started naming their ships after old Terran legends. Phoenix, Ghost, Hydra, even Vornak elite units were caught exchanging something called Earth memes on encrypted channels before drops. The war became a story, a human story, and stories are hard to kill. Then came the final stand, the last arc defense, on the gas giant moon of Brea. If it fell, core systems would collapse. Human-led fleets fought alongside fractured Council ships once enemies. Now coordinated like a single, desperate organism, it wasn't clean, it wasn't noble, it was chaos, fire, and blood. But when the Null flagship breached the final orbital layer, it was a Terran mining barge of all things that slammed into it at full speed, its reactor detonating. With a yield larger than anything previously sanctioned by the Council, the blast shattered the Tide's momentum. Their synaptic relays stuttered, and for the first time, they broke, retreated, not from fear, but from something worse. Adaptation, they couldn't outpace. When the dust cleared, no one cheered, not right away. They stood among wreckage, wounded and stunned, and then a Rosk warlord, blood still dripping from his broken crest, turned to a human commander and said, "You should have ruled us." The human smiled weakly. "We never wanted to." The Apex Council was never rebuilt in its place. Something new formed loose, strange, often contradictory, but unified, not by dominance, not by fear, but by survival shared, by a story written together. Humans did not rise to the top of galactic order. They tore the top off and invited everyone in, because to humanity, victory was never about conquering others. It was about never being alone in the fight.